Here's a conundrum for you. Humans, that's you and me, and everyone else who couldn't be here today, have come a long way. We've created steam engines, DVDs, low-fat butter, electrodes you can attach to the head of a Buddhist monk, Twitter, aeroplanes that can fly anywhere in the world except within 20,000 miles of a volcano that's erupted. So we did all that, well done. Whereas other animals have sort of stayed put, really. So why is that? Is it because we're just so clever? Or is it because other animals are more easily satisfied with what they have, whereas we are perpetually dissatisfied? First the wheel, then we want the cart, then we want the car, then we want a car that flies, the aeroplane, then we want an aeroplane that can fly through volcanic ash without crashing. Want. Are we hardwired to be dissatisfied with our lot? Perhaps the only reason my English teacher's cat never invented the vacuum cleaner was that it was satisfied lying in the sun. No need to. Didn't care about a bit of dust. So let's discuss the relationship between our nature, evolution, and of course, it seems to be popping up everywhere today, happiness. Panel of experts, some of whom you will have already seen this morning, moderated by Scott Stevens. Now, Scott is the ABC's religion and ethics editor. Before joining the ABC, he taught theology and ethics for many years, and even for a while was a parish minister with the Uniting Church in Australia. He's written extensively on the intersections between philosophy, theology, ethics, and even politics. So please welcome Scott and the panel, and Scott will introduce the panel. Here they are.
A helping hand, a thoughtful word, a worried friend, you reassure.
Wow, well, good morning. It's not often one has theme music. It's going to be playing over and over in my head for the rest of the day. I'll be walking into a building and expecting for it to... Well, it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome you here today, and of course to be able to welcome our panelists. If you've been here for the first part of the morning, then at least 3 of these panelists will already be familiar to you. We only have 30 minutes in what promises to be a very, very interesting session, and I think you'll agree that that's barely enough to even scratch the surface, so I don't want to linger too long over formalities. So let me just introduce our wonderful panel to you. Beginning on your far left, Paul Griffiths is the University Professorial Research Fellow in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and he has a joint appointment at the Centre for Genomics in Society at the University of Exeter. He is the author of Sex and Death, An Introduction to the Philosophy of Biology, which, by the way, is an extraordinarily good book. Anything that begins with sex and death, I mean, come on. And of course, what emotions really are. Seated on Paul's left, your right, is Dr. Ben Oldroyd, who is Professor of Behavioural Genetics at University of Sydney. His research has focused on honeybee societies and the evolution of worker sterility, which is one of the clearest examples, if you like, of altruism in nature. He's the author, among other things, of Asian Honeybees, Biology, Conservation, and Human Interactions. Not quite as sexy, but a wonderful sounding book nonetheless. Seated next to Ben is Matthieu Ricard, who is, of course, a Buddhist monk living in the Shechen Monastery in Nepal, where he coordinates the Karuna-Shechen Humanitarian projects. He's a well-known photographer, philosopher as well, I imagine, and the author of Happiness, a guide to developing life's most important skill, The Monk and the Philosopher, and the Art of Meditation. And of course, seated directly to my right is Dame Jane Goodall. She, of course, is an internationally renowned primatologist and environmentalist who is best known for her path-breaking work on the life and the threats facing chimpanzees. She has been a UN Messenger of Peace since 2002, and in 2006 she received the French Legion of Honor, as well as the UNESCO Gold Medal. Will you please join me in welcoming our panelists? It's a great pleasure to share this time with you, and thank you for your generosity. Now, the interrelated fields of philosophy, theology, ethics, and even economics have changed quite dramatically over the last 50 years. And one of the main drivers of that change has been the way that evolutionary biology, and even more recently, evolutionary psychology, has begun to encroach on those once sacred fields. And so that for many people today, the idea of humanity as somehow bearing a unique image of God, whatever that means, or even humanity as representing some kind of unique ethical agent, that we have a form of ethics that's unique to us, is no longer tenable for a lot of people today. So I wanted to begin with some kind of brief statement from each one of you about just how you see the relationship between humans and the rest of animals. Why is it, in other words, that we can learn from non-humans about what it means to live, to form good societies, and of course to be happy? Paul, would you like to go first?
Scott, I'm not sure I want to address exactly that question, but picking up on what you said immediately before, you talked about how some traditional sources of ideas about why one should be moral, why one should be ethical have disappeared, and we now have a view in which we're much more straightforward part of nature. I mean, my perspective on that is that from a biological point of view, anyone looking at human beings is forced to, in the word of a very great biologist, Conrad Waddington, that human beings are ethical animals. Human beings are ethical in the same sense that kangaroos live in mobs. The idea of human beings could somehow stop going in for ethics as an activity has always struck me as absurd. It's like imagining Ben's bees deciding to all become aquatic insects or something. I mean, it's simply not going to happen. So I think one thing we can be very clear about is that we might be puzzled as to the sources of ethical authority. We might not have an intellectual answer to the question, why be moral? But the idea that a human society for any significant period of time could simply abandon the project of having moral principles, enforcing those principles on other members of the community and being motivated by those principles, I think is entirely biologically unrealistic. And I think people worry far too much that just because we don't have a good story about why to be moral, somehow morality is going to go away.
Thank you. Ben?
Well, I work on bees, and I'm a bit perplexed as to why I'm at this meeting. But here I'll have a go. You people all probably think about a beehive as being a very altruistic place where everybody does their job and they work for the good of the colony and the good of the queen, and it's all very honky-dory and altruistic. But I'm here to tell you that this in fact is an untruth, and that in fact workers within colonies often do little rebellions and start laying eggs and not being altruistic. And this is sort of a recent discovery, by that I mean 15 years. But at the same time, the society survives because it has evolved mechanisms to suppress selfish behaviour. And I think at some level, any society has to evolve systems at a societal level to keep selfish behaviour under control for the good of the group. And I think perhaps that's the thing that I'm here to tell you about happiness.
Matthieu, thank you.
Yes, so I think if you think of the unbroken continuum between animals and the human beings as one of them, I know genetics, 99.5% of the genome of the chimpanzees are the same, 0.5% difference. And all the continuity of took millions and millions of years to have empathy, all those emotions, and so it's obvious that we are absolutely in that continuum. That completely destroy the arrogance of saying, because of our being smart and able to control others, that we can impose such a amount of suffering and exploitation, of devalorizing the very wish for life, and to avoid suffering of all those sentient beings, because simply we have the faculty of doing so. So I think the unethical aspect of that is very, very clear. And and we cannot avoid that, that conclusion unless we ignore that continuity. And I think that's one of the challenges of our times, that we simply blind ourselves. It's a lack of imagination. You know, Kafka said that war is the prodigious lack of imagination. We cannot put ourselves in under sentient being. We cannot imagine. My grandmother was fishing. I thought she was such a sweet grandmother. How could she do something wrong? I was not putting myself in the place of the fish that is taken with a hook. As I would be drawn in the water, he was taken in the air. I just could not imagine that. So empathy is something that is required to simply see what it could be to wish to be alive, not to suffer, and how we should therefore respect that. And we were talking in between that if people say there are more important things to do now than being busy with animals, you could certainly stop by eating them. You know, George Bernard Shaw said, "Animals are my friend, I don't eat my friends," which is a very good statement and easy to do, and that already makes such a difference. And it will change also for the environment. The second cause of global warming is industrial farming. Of course, it's self-enlightened interest, but at the same time, it's such a huge thing that we cannot ignore.
Thank you. And Jane?
Well, I think that, you know, all these 50 years of learning from the chimpanzees, helping us to understand, as you said, that we've been so arrogant in thinking we're just so special. But we are unique. There's no question. I mentioned that earlier. We've developed all this amazing technology. I would pick the difference as being the explosive development of the intellect. And I think that that's, well, my feeling is that once you get a language which enables us to have a discussion like this, and we could bring in the audience if there was time, and, you know, we could ask questions, and people could give stories from the past, and we could plan to all meet together in 5 years' time if we wanted to make that plan. And I think that's led to this explosively developed intellect. And, you know, that's why, you know, how come we're destroying the planet? But also, to develop the intellect, I think when you lose wisdom, you make a disconnect between the clever brain and the human heart, the seat of love and compassion. And if you have a human being who just relies on their intellect and doesn't have the empathy that you feel by using your heart, then you get a rather dangerous kind of creature. And we are learning more and more from different studies of different animals that we truly have been arrogant, and that animals can do way more than we thought. And there's stories of how dogs help people, dogs help cats, the animals that help each other in the wild as well as in captivity. It should make us feel a little bit shamefaced at the way we treat them.
What I find very interesting about each one of your statements, whether it be in the papers you've delivered this morning or just now, is that each one of you in different ways is almost bucking up against two reductions. The one reduction might be humanity is inherently superior, humanity by some kind of God-given right has domination over creation, therefore we can exploit, we can eat whatever we want. But then there's the other reduction, which says that humanity is, of course, no different from the rest of our, if you like, mammalian family. And therefore, any trait that we might regard as morality, as a cause for happiness, is in the end just a kind of emotive payoff for behaving in evolutionarily appropriate ways. I find that interesting that each one of you is arguing for a kind of renewed depth, both in the way that we see nature, the way that it behaves altruistically, the way that, but also kind of renewed depth in the way that we understand humanity as well. Is there anything that each of you would like to say about that? If not, let me throw a very particular problem to you. One of these reductions, which was, of course, most scandalously embodied in E.O. Wilson's monumental book, Sociobiology, which Peter Singer then tried to bring some kind of corrective to in The Expanding Circle, is the idea of innate moral pluralism in nature, such that, just to give his most scandalous example, it's proper it's understandable for male mammals to be utterly promiscuous, to, how should we say it, sow their seed widely, whereas it is evolutionarily inappropriate, immoral, for females to do the same. Now, this has been one of the big reductions in evolutionary theory and evolutionary morality in the last 30 years. Why is it, how is it, that humans are specifically different, or that they have a different ethical imperative on them?
Well, I think that I should defer to Ben Oldroyd here. I'm sure knows the science better than I do. But I think one of the great tragedies is how an idea like that can be put out as a result of a bunch of, and you know, a lot of respect for Ed Wilson, but I mean, he was doing work in the 70s and drawing on a bunch of other studies. That idea gets out there in the popular arena. And if you look at the contemporary evolutionary literature, it doesn't support that view of the difference between the reproductive imperatives and male. It still supports a view of the differences. But I mean, to be quite frank, when I go to hear an evolutionist giving a popular talk today, I'm much more likely to hear an evolutionist talking about our lovely little fairy, that wonderful research done at ANU, our lovely little fairy wrens here in Australia. If you're a male fairy wren, the chance that the egg in your nest is your egg is 25%. Okay. I think it's very silly for us to draw. Nature is extremely complicated. There are millions of species, all of them are different, and drawing direct moral lessons from a few studies on one or two species, it's simply a way of reinforcing your own prejudices. There are ways to learn from nature, but just picking, I mean, in some of those 1970s, you want to go and see a 1950s Doris Day comedy about trying to nail down your man to be married. And so you find a species in nature that looks like Rod Hudson and Doris Day. And you say, look, nature tells us to behave like that. Whereas if you're Tim Birkenhead, you can find a species where the females all behave like the ladies on Desperate Housewives. And while Tim Birkenhead would never do this, a popular writer might very well say, look, that's how we're meant to be. That's how nature is. We shouldn't try to take these simplistic lessons from nature.
Wonderful. Matthieu.
Yeah, to come back to your first question, which we were a bit speechless, is because of human intelligence, we have the power to do either extreme good or extreme devastation, which is unique. I think that's what makes the difference, the magnitude of the impact that we can have on everything, on everyone else. So, in a way, if we speak of civilization, it will be to put that to a benevolent use. And so now, sort of evolution has equipped us to take care of our maternal care, and that's probably the most obvious cause of taking care of others, so maternal care or parental care, and which gave birth to this idea that, if you sacrifice yourself for 8 nephews, and then your genes will be okay, and so forth. But it's very hard. I think Dawkins said that if you start taking care of everyone, it's just that the mechanism has got mad. It sort of slipped, just like it went out of control. So that's where intelligence comes in. Maybe evolution equipped us to take care of those who are dear to us, those who are close to us genetically, and those who treat us well. But maybe thanks to this intelligence and the fact that we can think bigger, we can use that evolution-given faculty to expand that to others without being an heretic move from the evolution perspective, because as we have been shown, the evolution of traits may be so that extended altruism based on biological altruism might be the way to then for humans to flourish better and have a better world, and then also thanks to this intelligence to then have a better consideration for the other species as well. So I think that is what is so special about intelligence, is we can use them to transcend the limitations of what we started with.
Please, Jane.
I think, there's one other point here, which is due to our intelligence, and that is chimpanzees can be altruistic. They can rescue other chimpanzees from drowning, non-related ones as well. That's just one example. And we talked earlier about the man who jumps into the water to rescue a child because he just does it, you know. On the other hand, as I think it was you saying, I can't remember now who said it, but, well, anyway, one of you was saying that a man can, who was talking about the Holocaust? It was you, yes. So you can, okay, you feel empathy with these poor Jews, and you think, well, I've got to do my bit, and I mustn't tell anyone because they might be implicated, so I've got to do it quietly, and I do it because I just feel I must, and I know I might suffer from it. I might be tortured myself. My family might suffer, but I have to do it. So we have this we're impelled to do this, and a chimpanzee couldn't think that way because the intellect doesn't enable them to. But by the very same token, I don't think a chimpanzee or any other animal could be what I would call evil. An evil which is a calculated, deliberate planning of mental or physical torture. So it's our brain that enables us to be, on the one hand, much worse, but on the other hand, much better. And, you know, the idea of let's get together and learn how to feel more compassion and more empathy to make a better world. I love that idea. I think it's great.
Thank you.
Let me put something very specific to the four of you. By training, I suppose you could call it an Aristotelian philosopher. I'm most interested in Aristotle, and then the influence that Aristotle had on subsequent both Christian and Western thought. But it just strikes me that questions of happiness, of well-being, of the good life, not just, you know, a life that feels good, but a life that can genuinely be described as good. These things all used to be part and parcel of questions you would pose to philosophers and theologians and whatever. And it just strikes me today that whereas historically our questions, these questions about well-being and the common good, used to be answered with reference to the community in which one finds oneself. These dense organic relationships that most of us find our lives in, not just families, but also communities and ultimately one's nation and whatever. You know, we're living in a time when those bonds are fractured and broken. Local communities virtually no longer exist. Families can very rarely be described as places of stability. I'm curious. I don't mean to put you all in this, well, I do mean to put you all in the spot, but we've got people who are interested in naturalism, evolutionary biology, and a Buddhist monk here. Is the reason you've been invited onto this panel to talk about happiness is because the organizers are imagining that you'll be looking within to meditative practices or to part of our biological inheritance, because we can no longer look for sources of happiness where we once did, in our communities, in families, in nations, and so forth.
Well, then I'll jump in there.
Please, Jane.
Yeah.
I was hoping you would bite at the bait.
Well, I bite at the bait because the people you're talking to, where family isn't important and so forth, it's not the whole world. And huge, I mean, millions and millions of people around the world have an intact family structure, an intact community. Some of them are even quite separated from other communities. People living in the heart of the Ecuadorian jungle, for example, where there aren't even any roads. So I think you're talking about Western society.
Yes, that's right.
Western so-called civilization. And I don't know, it would be interesting. I wish we could ask everybody. We'll ask the panel. I mean, for me, family is very, very important. It always has been. My mother was perhaps the most inspirational person in my life, but the whole rest of the family in which I grew up, and today there's my son and his family, my sister and her family. And this is really the heart of who I am.
Matthieu, please.
Yeah, if you think of the modern concept of finding happiness, endless succession of pleasures, the hedonic, buy this toothpaste and you'll be happy, or something like that. And versus the eudaimonic perception of well-being as a state of flourishing. Now, if you see the problem in the family, problem in society, even problem in humanitarian world, the grains of sand that bring that to a halt is conflicts of ego, or greed, or corruption. And within family, it is selfishness and arrogance and lack of tolerance, openness, and loving kindness. So, although it is based on relation to others, but it's also due to lack of having cultivated the inner conditions. So if you say, well, it's quite selfish to drop your family and then meditate, if inner transformation is about to eradicate selfishness, you cannot say it's selfish. But then when your transformation has taken place, then naturally, without making it a big deal, by what you are, the way you relate in every single word, in every single way you look at the other, you will naturally bring that trust, that confidence. You will diffuse aggressive emotions of aggressivity and so forth. That will go in the family, in the community. So it will then go from inside out. So the inner transformation is the fundamental aspect of it. And then it immediately radiates. And the more the people do that, then the more there will be harmony within the family and within the community and in the world at large. So those two are completely, it's like the two blades of a knife that sharpen each other. And likewise, the individual transformation and transformation of culture are also, through neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and so forth, that individuals change culture and cultures will change individuals. This is constant feedback.
Marvelous. Ben?
I think you can get, at another level, very mechanistic about happiness. I mean, happiness, to some extent, is the number of dopamine receptors you have in your brain, which are receiving whatever they're receiving. And so you can, I'll tell you a story about some voles. Voles are little mouse-like creatures that live in two populations in the United States, one at the top of the mountain and one at the bottom. The one at the top of the mountain is very promiscuous. No, it's the other way around. The one at the top of the mountain is monogamous, and the one at the bottom of the mountain is promiscuous. And this difference is entirely determined by a single dopamine receptor in their brain. And if you put two of the mountain voles together, like the male and the female, they feel happy. You know they feel happy because you can see the expression of this gene in their brain. You could even select for greater expression of this gene and produce a more monogamous vole because it feels happy when it's together with its partner. The other ones with a short, which don't express this gene well, promiscuous. They don't feel any happiness when they're with their partner or with other voles. So to some extent you can look at happiness in a very mechanistic sense. At the same time, I guess I would like to emphasize that happiness comes through a society interacting, and I think I'm being a little bit contradictory there. Save me, Paul.
Well, as somebody who works on bees, it's inevitable that you'd have the second thought. I think what Matthieu said is absolutely correct, that clearly there's a cyclical kind of process here. Actually, following this idea of just introducing, there's an experiment that many of you will be familiar with, one of the most famous experiments in behavioral economics. I forget if it's Fear or somebody else who did this one. Matthieu made over. This is a famous experiment in which you look at the extent to which people behave cooperatively in experimental bargaining games before and after studying undergraduate economics. Okay. And it seems to me that...
This is the opposite of the compassion gymnasium that Matthieu was speaking of before.
So it seems to me that if you want to have a society that doesn't work very well, a society where we get the kinds of dysfunctional financial systems that we have, taking perfectly well-intentioned young people and indoctrinating with the view that it's naive and stupid to cooperate, and that you're only ruining your own life and everybody else's if you cooperate, is not a very productive way to build a better society.
Yes. And that strikes me as a wonderful note to finish on. Will you please join me in thanking our panel?